Well, hello, everybody. I'm Michael Meneer. I'm president and CEO of the Pacific Salmon Foundation, located in Vancouver, British Columbia. And I feel humbled and delighted to record this presentation for you for Fisheries Management Scotland's annual conference. I'm really pleased to be invited by my new friend, Dr. Alan Wells, to make this presentation. It's a reprise of a presentation I gave in late January when we came over to London for the Wild Salmon Connections Conference, which Alan was very instrumental and others at Fisheries Management Scotland in pulling this conference off. And so thank you, Alan, and your team, and all of you in the wild salmon community for inviting me to make this presentation to you. So here we go. It's called People for Salmon. We use this phrase not just for the name of a presentation, but it's actually our motto at the Pacific Salmon Foundation. And as I think you'll see in my presentation here, it really reflects who we are as an organization. Our wild salmon are challenged, and it's going to take people working together collaboratively with government, nonprofits, indigenous nations, everybody really, to ensure that wild salmon have a strong future everywhere that they live and roam. And of course, people need those salmon, and the salmon need our people. And so that's the purpose of this presentation. It's the motto of our organization, and I think that'll all make sense here as I carry on. Now, just to give you a little bit of context about the state of wild Pacific salmon, and I should say the Pacific Salmon Foundation, or PSF as we refer to ourselves, we're a nonprofit organization. We work primarily in British Columbia and the Yukon, the western provinces and territory of Canada. But we work very closely with our American friends and colleagues in Alaska, Washington State, Oregon, and California. Because many of our jurisdictions, really all of our salmon jurisdictions, regardless of nationality, are challenged. And in British Columbia in particular, we recently conducted a thorough state of salmon assessment and published a fantastic report on this last year that I'd be happy to share. But in a nutshell, more than 70% of our wild Pacific salmon populations are below average. So that's a pretty dire statistic. We view our wild Pacific salmon writ large as being in crisis. And we recognize that this may not be as dire as you are facing in Scotland and other jurisdictions, Iceland, Norway, etc., are facing with Atlantic salmon. But I think it's fair to say, and our Wild Salmon Connections Conference affirmed that wild salmon, wherever they are, Atlantic or Pacific, are facing very serious threats, many of them human-caused threats, and many of them exacerbated by climate change and all that we are dealing with in that context. So it's a challenging situation for us here on the West Coast as well. But we are very fortunate that in British Columbia, we have a very strong commitment from British Columbians to wild Pacific salmon. We regularly conduct public opinion polling on Pacific salmon and how do British Columbians feel about Pacific salmon. And very consistently, we find that 85% of British Columbians say they are deeply concerned about salmon stocks, and that they rank the preservation, the rebuilding, and the resilience of our wild Pacific salmon stocks as their top environmental concern. This often outranks things like single-use plastics, climate change in general. So obviously people care deeply about wild Pacific salmon in British Columbia. And I would suggest doing this kind of public opinion polling, surveying of the public is a very, very powerful tool. It's a powerful tool to share with politicians. We're getting ready to go into a federal election, and politicians care about polls and how their constituents feel about issues. So this is a powerful tool that we can share. Now, we also have a funding mechanism that I want to share with you that I think is a very valuable tool and that I know that caught a lot of attention when we presented in London, and that is our Wild Salmon Conservation Stamp. And this is a stamp that was created back in 1989. We were founded in 87. We got the federal government to create this conservation stamp in 1989. Now, this is not a postage stamp that you put on your parcels to mail. When you go to purchase your saltwater fishing license in Canada, in British Columbia, you have to buy a conservation stamp, and it's about $7 per license if you want to keep your catch, of course, within regulations. We generate from that salmon conservation stamp $1.8 million a year that comes to the Pacific Salmon Foundation, and then we distribute through a network of grassroots and community and indigenous partners. There are about 340 rivershed or catchment organizations that are working on habitat, education, in some cases hatchery, conservation hatcheries. And the ability to bring $1.8 million a year to distribute to those groups is very, very powerful. So over time, we've generated over $20 million through this stamp, but the real power is with the volunteers and the catchment-based groups, because they then go out and raise another $6 or $7 for every dollar that we give them from the salmon conservation stamp. We call this our community salmon program, and it's probably one of the best examples of constructive, positive program for people for salmon. So, in a nutshell, one of the things that we are really focusing on with our governments, particularly in economically challenging times, is the concept of user fees. So a salmon conservation stamp would be an excellent example of this. It doesn't hit the general revenue, the taxpayer revenue that government is worried about. Our provincial government's got a $10 billion deficit as we speak. So I think finding these creative ideas like user fees that you can explore, even working with the recreational angling industry. We have a number of fishing lodge and guides. Many of them will add a small surcharge, conservation surcharge, when they work with clients that they then pass on to this type of community-based work. Our organization went through a strategic planning process last year and have come up with this context statement that really drives how we operate, that we're focused on salmon recovery and resilience in a time of climate change and indigenous reconciliation. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. But this is our framing context, and I think it's so important to have. And reconciliation really is recognizing people and the particular important connection of salmon to our indigenous populations in British Columbia that I'll talk a little bit more in just a second. But this is a picture of a woman from a nation called the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation that are very close to Vancouver. We have a number of partnerships with them in the marine context, working on studying the state of salmon and rebuilding efforts. Now, talking about the indigenous context for us in Canada, this is a great photo of my friend Stu Barnes, who's the president and chief executive officer of the First Nations Fisheries Council of British Columbia. And Stu joined us at the conference, and we're delighted that we recently signed. That picture in the background there is a memorandum of understanding that we recently signed with First Nations Fisheries Council. Just for some context, we have 210 sovereign Indigenous nations in British Columbia alone. Indigenous people make up about 6-7% of our population. And more importantly, salmon are a vitally important species to First Nations. Really, they view salmon as a relative to be cherished and protected. Certainly, they eat salmon, and there are economic fisheries associated with First Nations, but for time immemorial, this is a very sacred cultural and religious species that's linked to First Nations people. And, they've been there a lot longer than people who look like me, who settled British Columbia in the last 200 years or so. So their connection and their knowledge, we are really leaning into building these relationships with Indigenous communities and nations. Our strategic context and framework revolves at the Salmon Foundation around three things. Systems transformation, which I'm going to talk mostly about today, is a major part of it. Salmon recovery, I've used that words a couple of times. What do we mean by that? Well, that's restoring the habitat and the salmon populations, and addressing the factors that are limiting habitat and populations, and that have led to degradation of salmon populations. So this is really focused on those populations that are in the worst shape and trying to figure out strategies at a catchment and regional basis to rebuild these populations to at least some level of their previous abundance and health. And then the salmon resilience piece, again, focusing on habitat and the fish. How do we help populations, and particularly those populations that are doing okay or that are on the bubble, as we say? How do we help these populations be most resilient given the challenges that we know are only going to increase with weather variability, more floods, fires, drought, higher water temperatures as a result of climate change? One of the things that we've been doing to advance systems transformation is what we call our Salmon Action Dialogues. And this is an example of a group of people. They're First Nations people, they are recreational angling people, the federal government people there I see, we have provincial government people there, a number of catchments. And this is our leadership group. This isn't even the whole group. We've had a couple hundred people participating in these dialogues over the last 3 years. And all of these dialogues have led us to this systems transformation that I'm articulating. And it's really emblematic of what we've been talking about in terms of extinction's not an option. And it's going to take all of us coming together, even though we may not have worked together in the past, even though we may have had disagreements in the past or perceptions of each other that were inaccurate. We've tried to create a space, a forum through these Salmon Action Dialogues for people to come together and say, we're not talking about harvest. We're not talking about the really big contentious issues. We are talking about salmon recovery and resilience, because that's something we can all agree on. And what are the things that we can do together? Start with those things that you agree on, that you know are necessary. And if we don't have wild salmon, nobody's going fishing. So we know that fish have to drive everything, and bringing people together around rebuilding salmon is absolutely critical. So these Salmon Action Dialogues have led us to a place where we are calling for what we call a Made in BC salmon recovery system. And it's really inspired and very analogous to what you are doing in Scotland with your Fisheries Management Scotland program, where you're developing a frame for coordination at different scales. And then you're also trying to develop a fund outside of government that will drive investments in these programs. But you'll see in general here, my point in sharing this is that we are trying to move in that same direction of coordination and collaboration at multiple scales. This is, not sexy stuff. I get it. It's complicated. It's like student council governance sort of things. But we have simply come to the belief after, organizations nearly 40 years old, been doing this for a long time, that this is the way we've got to go. We've got to get our people house in order. We've got a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of great work, but we've got to have a better structure, a better frame for planning and implementing activities for salmon if we're going to have a chance. And this is just in kind of a nutshell the outcome that we have had from our Made in BC model and our Salmon Action Dialogues. And we will be continuing to do these through our current strategic plan through 2028. So, all of this is kind of theoretical here on these slides. I want to show you some examples of where we're actually taking what we're hearing through the Salmon Action Dialogues and putting it into practice for the fish. And the pictures that we're looking here are from a river called the Bridge River, which runs into the Fraser River, which is, I think, the second largest salmon-bearing river in the world, runs through Vancouver. About 70% of our population lives around the Fraser River. We had a major obstruction due to irregularities in water flow 2 years ago at the confluence of the Bridge River and the Fraser River. And we actually were alerted to this when we saw in the newspaper these amazing photographs of First Nations people down at the river handing fish up and trying to move the fish together through a human chain over the obstruction, which was very dangerous, unsecure, but so motivating and powerful. And so we saw this, and we immediately phoned our First Nations partners in the region and asked, was there anything that we could do? and we were invited in to be a part of their planning process. And the thing that we realized very quickly was that government was moving too slow. And then the second piece was they needed money to actually break through this barrier. And so you see on the very top there a what's called a spider excavator that has to crawl down this very treacherous habitat and was able to jackhammer through and open up fish habitat so that these fish that could get through. Now, some of the things that we heard from our government were like, well, this has happened late in the salmon run, and most of the salmon are through. But the First Nations people that were there were telling us there were hundreds, maybe thousands of salmon backed up, hitting their heads against the rock, trying to get through this obstruction. And so that's where a group like PSF and FMS, I think, can come in and help break through the BS. Government's trying to do the right thing, but government is slow and it can be oftentimes constrained. And PSF can say, look, we've got the funding, we've got the partnerships, we'll help get this done where everyone can be seen as a winner. And as a result, we were able to break through, and those fish were able to get through, and God willing, most of them were able to spawn. And now we're working on a long-term that the nation is leading, a long-term fix for that problem. The big thing you see there on the left is a fish ladder that typically works, but in this particular year, it was rendered useless. And just to close, we can't always be about the crisis. It can't be all doom and gloom. We have some signs of recovery. Where we have leaned into working collaboratively, where investment from the government and the private sector have been flowing, is one species, coho salmon in the Fraser River. And we are beginning to see we saw a crisis in the early 2000s. We've seen a recovery and rebuilding program over the last 20 years, and now we're beginning to see a trend line moving in the positive direction. We took a pause from fishing, all types of fishing for coho. We invested significant dollars from both the private sector as well as the Pacific Salmon Foundation. And this has been a good example of recovery that we're seeing. So it is not all dire, and I think that's an absolutely critical part of this, is to make sure that people know that there is hope, that we can rebuild and recover salmon populations. These are tremendously resilient fish, as you know, and sometimes the best thing we can do is get out of their way and let them do their thing, open up and protect their habitat. So that's all for me. Just a couple pictures here, beautiful pictures of Pacific salmon in their native habitat. You're all invited and welcome to come to British Columbia and learn about what we're doing in BC, and we can learn from you, obviously. And as I mentioned, that that need to work collaboratively to make sure that the habitat is open for the fish to get back to spawn. This is a beautiful example of a fish returning to its spawning habitat. So I hope this presentation has been useful. I hope it's shared some knowledge from a different jurisdiction. I hope it shows you how important the People for Salmon focus is, and the amazing things that we can all do together. And I would add to those three scales that I showed you earlier, a fourth scale, the international scale. And I want to thank Alan, Wild Salmon Connections, Atlantic Salmon Trust, Fisheries Management Scotland, and all the entities involved over there for inviting us over for the conference. We learned a lot. We learned a lot about the state of Atlantic salmon. We learned a lot that we have common limiting factors, that we can support each other with science and advocacy. And I think we also learned that wild salmon is this great galvanizing and uniting force globally. And so one of the things we're pursuing, for example, is a International Wild Salmon Day, where on one day we all have the same messages and advertisements on the internet and on television. We're all going to our governments on one day with one common message: extinction is not an option. We need clean, cold water and protected and preserved habitats for our wild salmon. And if you do that for our wild salmon, you are protecting and preserving the health and the well-being of all of us. So with that, I thank you so much for this opportunity, and I wish you a very successful conference.